Good morning. Okay, so Orwell chapter 1 today, 1984 chapter 1. First, a little bit of housekeeping. So tomorrow, which is Thursday the 9th, we're doing the first live class session on Zoom at 9:30 a.m. 9:30 a.m. So it's on RenWeb under tomorrow's lesson plan, and I'll send an email out to you and your parents today, just so we can be sure. But 9:30 a.m. tomorrow, we'll do a live class session. And we're going to plan on reading chapter 2, and if we can take any questions about stuff we've done since we've been online, um, and go from there. Okay, and it shouldn't max 40 minutes, right? And I don't want to take up your time. So that's tomorrow, 9:30, and homework will be attendance with that. So looking forward to it. And like I said, 1984 chapter 1 today. So couple things on that. I'm going to try to be a little more systematic as we go through this book, and so I'm following an outline for chapter 1, which I'll make available on a Google Doc on RenWeb for you, just so we can have a framework for reading this. And here's how it's going to go today. So chapter 1, I think we get the setting. So characters, what's the setting like? And then there's this act of writing. So Winston, the main character, sits down to write a diary, more or less, and that brings up some memories for him. So that's the third point I want to make, is the act of writing calls certain things to mind, like it usually does, and he thinks about something that happened to him during the day, and then fourth is this idea of the hate, right, or the 2-minute hate, that little propaganda program they show every day in Oceania. And so that's the framework in which I want to look at chapter 1. Now, as we're going through this book, because like we said yesterday, this isn't solely about Soviet Russia, but there are so many similarities to Soviet Russia that are obvious. One of the authors we're going to have to read a little bit is Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Solzhenitsyn, and he wrote a lot of things, but his most famous work is a 3-volume work called the Gulag Archipelago, and I want to expose you to that book as we go through 1984. And so a couple things about Solzhenitsyn just before we get going. He was a Red Army officer in World War II. He was an artillery captain, I think, and he had written disparaging things about Stalin in some of his private letters, and so he was sent to the Gulag camps, and that title, the Gulag Archipelago, right? An archipelago is a chain of islands. That's his word. That's his metaphor for the network of labor camps, forced labor camps throughout the Soviet Union. It was very much a secret until he came out with this book. No one knew what was going on in those camps. But he spent like 10 years in the labor camps, and then when he got out, I think he had cancer right away, and he wrote this book, which it's massive. I mean, it's a 3-volume work, and like these things are 600 or 700 pages each. I'm like halfway through the second volume. It was taking about a year to get there, and it's very intense writing. Like it's written at a high emotional pitch, and it's difficult to read, let's say. Now, he wrote that he committed it to memory in the labor camps and wrote it in secret and risked his life to get that work out to the world. And he won a Nobel Prize in 1970 for it. So we're going to read a couple things from Solzhenitsyn too today in the context of how we're looking through chapter 1. So let's get to it. Setting. I said setting. It's kind of the first thing we get, and we meet our main character Winston on the very first page. So this is page 1. The face of a man about 45. Oh, pardon me. No, this is see, we don't even get the individual yet. So this is Big Brother first. And so I'm going to pull up on my screen share a picture of Stalin. And there were no pictures of Stalin in the Soviet Union that weren't idealized, because that was their way of doing propaganda around him, is he could only look good and look like kind of like the benevolent grandfather figure. So I'm going to read the description of Big Brother, a term which Orwell coined, right? We use Big Brother to talk about any sort of creepy big government stuff, but Orwell coined the term. And here's Big Brother in Oceania. The face of a man about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. So that's I think a pretty clear allusion to Stalin. If you looked at the picture. And that's one of the very first things in the book. That's like second paragraph. Okay, here's Winston then. Here's our main character. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times along the way. On each landing opposite the lift shaft, the poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. Okay, so Winston, about 39-year-old man, and he works in the Ministry of Truth. Okay, and so that's the other part of the setting. So we get our main character, we get the ubiquitous presence of Big Brother in these big creepy posters. He says the eyes follow you everywhere you go. And then this thing in his apartment called a telescreen, and it's like a TV that transmits, but it also watches him. So Big Brother is watching you. That's on the poster, and that's the mood, that's the tone, that's the main setting too. Individual buried in this oppressive totalitarian state. And speaking of the state, that the other part of the setting are these ministries, and there's 4 of them, right? So Winston works in the Ministry of Truth, and here's a bit about these other ministries. They were I'm on page 4. They were the homes of the 4 ministries between which the entire apparatus of government was divided. The Ministry of Truth, which concerned itself with news, entertainment, education, and the fine arts. And listen for the irony, the sarcastic, it's sardonic irony of these descriptions. The Ministry of Peace, which concerned itself with war. The Ministry of Love, which maintained law and order. And the Ministry of Plenty, which was responsible for economic affairs. Their names in newspeak: Many True, Many Pax, Many Love, and Many Plenty. Now go back. The Ministry of Love was the really frightening one. And what does the Ministry of Love deal with? Law and order, because that's the scary part of a totalitarian state, right? Law and order. Now, Winston's in his apartment, and he's trying to stay out of the way of, or stay out of the view of the telescreen, because what's he going to do? And this is the second thing I want to get out of the first chapter. He's going to put some thoughts down on paper. He's going to turn to the act of writing a diary, and he has a sense of dread about it, and you might wonder why that is. So this passage answers, the thing that he was about to do was open a diary. This was not illegal. Nothing was illegal since there were no longer any laws. But if detected, it was reasonably certain that it would be punished by death, or at least by 25 years in a forced labor camp. Okay, so again, the sarcastic wit. It's not illegal, but it would be punishable by death, or at least 25 years of hard labor. And again, we'll read passages from Solzhenitsyn that talk about exactly this in the Soviet Union. One good example that comes to mind, because he has hundreds of examples of these kinds of arrests, and the one I'm thinking of is a workman somewhere in the Soviet Union who, no, it was like a valet or something, and his master, the guy he worked for, had purchased a bust of Stalin, so a picture or a statue of Stalin's head, and it was too heavy for the old man, and so he tied his belt around the neck and slung it over his back and used that to carry it back to his employer's house. And he was given like 10 years of hard labor because that was supposedly a counter-revolutionary measure. They said he was like hanging in effigy of Stalin just for carrying the bust in the wrong way. And so that's Ministry of Love stuff, I guess, in real life. And it's saying keeping a diary. Not illegal, but you might get 25 years for it. Okay, so he sits down to write, and what's he start writing about? And I'm not going to read it, but this passage is worth going back to. He writes about going to how does he say it? Last night to the flicks. So he goes to the movies, and they show war movies. And the description of the movie he watched is more like a massacre than a war movie. So he talks about refugees trying to flee in boats and helicopters, and the movie's from the helicopter's point of view, zeroing in on them and blowing up these rafts full of refugees and women and children. And it's a violent description, and he's writing about it like he's desensitized to the violence, but he's also shocked by it. And so that's what he starts writing about. And what happens then? So this is the third point. The act of setting pen to paper calls something to mind, something that had happened during his day at the office, at the Ministry of Truth. And we're introduced to two more characters. So there's this young lady who's, I mean, he calls her beautiful, but he also loathes her. And he says it's because it'd be like the equivalent of a Hitler Youth type. So she's really orthodox and way into the party. And then she wears this like chastity sash thing. She's part of the anti-sex league, I think they call it. And Winston's frightened of her because, well, here's why. So in the Soviet Union, and again, we'll mine Solzhenitsyn for passages about this, but it became the case that like 2/3 of people were informing on their friends and neighbors to the government for counter-revolutionary activities. And so if the old lady in the flat above you had a nicer apartment than you, and maybe you wanted to move in there, you could just denounce her to the Soviet authorities and they'd take her away. And what Solzhenitsyn lays out and reveals very clearly is that they had quotas for arrests to the forced labor camps because communism doesn't work, and it turns out you have to run your economy as a slave state, basically. So they needed people in the labor camps, and the Soviets literally had quotas for making arrests. So it was often very profitable to denounce your neighbors and your friends, and sometimes even your own family. Husbands denouncing wives. Solzhenitsyn tells stories of women being jealous of another woman's husband, and so they denounce the wife, and then go swoop in and take the husband. So horrid stuff like that. Now, Winston thinks that this young woman is the kind of person who would denounce, I think. So she's one. And then there's this guy named O'Brien, and he's a higher level party member. Winston he can't even imagine what office he might hold. And he has some reason to believe that O'Brien isn't perfectly orthodox. Here's a passage, page 11. A secretly held belief, or perhaps not even a belief, merely a hope, that O'Brien's political orthodoxy was not perfect. Something in his face suggested it irresistibly. Now we're going to come back to that at the end. He has a reason to believe that O'Brien's not orthodox. But those are the two people he remembers as he sits down to write. And then fourth point here. So he's thinking about work during the day. And then there's this program called the 2-Minute Hate, and it's a propaganda program. And so he's remembering during the workday what had happened with those two people around the hate, the 2-minute hate. And it's classic propaganda technique that's still used in political ads today. Maybe not this extreme, but listen to this. So they're in the office. The next moment, a hideous grinding screech, as of some monstrous machine running without oil, burst from the big telescreen at the end of the room. It was a noise that set one's teeth on edge and bristled the hair at the back of one's neck. The hate had started. As usual, the face of Emmanuel Goldstein, the enemy of the people, had flashed onto the screen. There were hisses here and there among the audience. So I don't know if you guys know any logic and rhetoric, but there's a classic propaganda technique called transfer. And so what you do is, if you're showing a video and you want to make your viewers feel negatively about your opponent, you play some like discordant music or like this, a screechy mechanical sound or something unsettling, and you show images of war and disorder, and then as those images and sounds are having an unpleasant effect on the audience, you show your opponent's face. So that's exactly what happens. And again, the description of Emanuel Goldstein. So he's in some sense maybe the scapegoat, you could say. But oh, I forgot to screen share. It's another I think allusion to Soviet Russia. So here's Goldstein's face, and I'm going to, pardon me, show you a picture of a man called Leon Trotsky. So in the Russian Revolution, you had what was called the Old Guard, and so that they were the original Bolsheviks. Stalin was their leader, and they were the ones who overthrew the Tsarist government in 1917. And Trotsky was one of the members of the Old Guard, and he was high up in Lenin's government. And it's like, I don't know the ins and outs of Marxist thought probably as well as I should, but I know that Trotsky had after Stalin died, or pardon me, not Stalin, after Lenin died, Trotsky had his own kind of school of interpretation of Marxist thought called Trotskyism. And basically Stalin won out. Stalin was Lenin's right-hand man. And Trotsky was out, I think, by the 1930s. And anyone who followed him was anathema in Stalin's government. And Trotsky ended up being assassinated, I think, in like Mexico or South America, somewhere in the 1940s. I think he made it to 1946, and some Soviet thug killed him with an ice pick. But so I'll go back. Sorry, I didn't read the description. Here's his face. Now listen to Goldstein's description. It was a lean Jewish face with a great fuzzy aureola of white hair and a small goatee beard. A clever face, and yet somehow inherently despicable. I think the illusion is clear. And Goldstein he's the enemy of the state, and they show these propaganda films like multiple times a day, demonizing him and any of his followers, but no one knows if he's even alive or if he even exists. And it seems like there's no followers, but they make arrests in the name of being conspirators with Emanuel Goldstein. Okay. And as people watch this 2-minute hate, it gets them worked up into a frenzy. And now I think we can see, so we had mimetic desire in Brothers Karamazov. Rene Girard has also this thing called mimetic contagion that he lays out, and it's when mimetic rivalries all sort of feed off each other, and people get worked up into a frenzy, and then all that hatred and violence is directed against one individual, a scapegoat. So I think this is an apt description of Girard's phenomenon. The horrible thing about the 2 minutes hate was not that one was obliged to act a part, but that it was impossible to avoid joining in, like a contagion. Within 30 seconds, any pretense was always unnecessary. A hideous ecstasy of fear and vindictiveness, a desire to kill, to torture, to smash faces in with a sledgehammer, seemed to flow through the whole group of people like an electric current, turning one, even against one's will, into a grimacing, screaming lunatic. And yet the rage that one felt was an abstract, undirected emotion, which could be switched from one object to another like the flame of a blow lamp. So that's propaganda, right? Transfer. You channel people's emotions and direct them against what you want. And again, I think it's propaganda and torture in 1984 that are used to cow the people into submission. Okay, and here's just how violent this sort of mimetic contagion can get. This is a disturbing passage, but it's revealing. It was even possible at moments to switch one's hatred this way or that by a voluntary act. Suddenly, by the sort of violent effort with which one wrenches one's head away from the pillow in a nightmare, Winston succeeded in transferring his hatred from the face on the screen to the dark-haired girl behind him. This is that woman he doesn't like. Vivid, beautiful hallucinations flashed through his mind. He would flog her to death with a rubber truncheon. He would tie her naked to a stake and shoot her full of arrows like Saint Sebastian. He would ravish her and cut her throat at the moment of climax. Better than before, moreover, he realized why it was that he hated her. So this is revealing. It's sort of the genesis of his hatred. He hated her because she was young and pretty and sexless, and because he wanted to go to bed with her and would never do so, because round her sweet, supple waist, which seemed to ask you to encircle it with your arm, there was only the odious scarlet sash, aggressive symbol of chastity. Okay, and so that's a clear description of lust, which leads to this resentful violence, but it's how would you say it? It's used or channeled by the state. And you can see it coming out in this when he watches this propaganda film. All of a sudden, these horrid, violent emotions are welling up in him, and the state's trying to get all of that directed at their who they don't want, people out of the party, enemies to the party. But Winston sees that he's able to get to the bottom of what he's really feeling, and I think that's going to prove important. Now, he's still remembering all this and trying to write it down while the hate is ending. And the way they end it is they show a picture of Big Brother, and the music settles and everything's okay again. And again, that's transfer. But he catches O'Brien's eye, so I'm on page 17. Momentarily, he caught O'Brien's eye. O'Brien had stood up. He had taken off his spectacles and was in the act of resettling them on his nose with his characteristic gesture. But there was a fraction of a second when their eyes met, and for as long as it took to happen, Winston knew, yes, he knew, that O'Brien was thinking the same thing as itself. An unmistakable message had passed. It was as though their two minds had opened, and their thoughts were flowing from one into the other through their eyes. I am with you, O'Brien seemed to be saying to him. I know precisely what you are feeling. I know all about your contempt, your hatred, your disgust. But don't worry, I am on your side. So that's a moment of real human connection, which is basically forbidden in the state they live in, right, in Oceania. And O'Brien's a higher up party member, remember? So Winston thinks he might be sympathetic, but it's only for a moment, and you can't talk about it. You can't talk about it, otherwise, Big Brother's gotcha. Okay, and as he's remembering all this in writing, he sort of comes back to the present, and he's realized he's written down with Big Brother in big capital letters all over his page over and over again. And then someone knocks at his door, and that's where the chapter ends. Now, I want to end with this, and then we'll turn to two passages from Solzhenitsyn. He's talking about the arrests. So it was always at night. I'm on page 19. The arrests always invariably happened at night. The sudden jerk out of sleep, the rough hand shaking your shoulder, the lights glaring in your eyes, the ring of hard faces round the bed. In the vast majority of cases, there was no trial, no report of the arrest. People simply disappeared, always during the night. Your name was removed from the registers. Every record of everything you had ever done was wiped out. Your one-time existence was denied and then forgotten. You were abolished, annihilated. Vaporized was the usual word. Okay, that's almost exactly like the description I'm about to read you from Solzhenitsyn, and it's the way he starts his Gulag Archipelago, but here's the man. And so this is Alexander Solzhenitsyn as a Red Army officer in 1943, and then here he is in the 70s, shortly after he won the Nobel Prize. And again, I told you he had a tough life. So he was an officer on the Eastern Front in World War II, which if you know anything about the Eastern Front in World War II, there aren't many times and places in human history that would have been worse to be. 20 million Russian soldiers died in World War II. And so he was there, and then in the Gulag, and then he had cancer, and then he was exiled from Russia, and that's that. And so he's a man of staggering moral force, I would say. And I don't think there's a more important author from the 20th century you can read than Solzhenitsyn. And we're not going to ask you to read him, but we're reading 1984 instead, and we're going to look at a little bit of Solzhenitsyn. So Here's from the very beginning of Volume 1 of the Gulag Archipelago, and think about that passage on arrest I just read. How do people get to this clandestine archipelago? Hour by hour, planes fly there, ships steer their course there, and trains thunder off to it, but all with nary a mark on them to tell of their destination. And remember, the archipelago is the chain of forced labor camps, thousands of them all throughout the Soviet Union. And at ticket windows or at travel bureaus for Soviet or foreign tourists, the employees would be astounded if you were to ask for a ticket to go there. They know nothing, and they've never heard of the archipelago as a whole or of any one of its innumerable islands. Those who go to the archipelago to administer it get there via the training schools of the Ministry of Internal Affairs. Those who go there to be guards are conscripted via the military conscription centers. And those, like you and me, dear reader, who go there to die, must get there solely and compulsorily via arrest. Arrest. Need it be said that it is a breaking point in your life, a bolt of lightning which has scored a direct hit on you, that it is an unassimilable spiritual earthquake not every person can cope with, as a result of which people often slip into insanity? The universe has as many different centers as there are living beings in it. Each of us is a center of the universe, and that universe is shattered when they hiss at you. You are under arrest. If you are arrested, can anything else remain unshattered by this cataclysm? So that sounds very much like Orwell's description, it's such an idea. Each of us is a center of the universe, and there's as many centers of the universe as there are people. What a way to look at people. Okay, and he only realized that after a decade in forced labor and seeing all these people and collecting their stories. Now, here's something on his motivation to write, which is a beautiful, beautiful passage. And again, he does have this irresistible moral force, Solzhenitsyn does with his writing. It's like he saw so much injustice and suffering that the only thing left for him was to tell the truth somehow, so everyone would know about it. And he had to scream it over 2,000 pages of genius outrage. And the book did help bring down the Soviet Union, so that's that. Now, fire. The branches crackle, and the night wind of late autumn blows the flame of the bonfire back and forth. The compound is dark. I am alone at the bonfire, and I can bring it still more carpenter's shavings. The compound here is a privileged one, so privileged that it is almost as if I were out in freedom. This is an island of paradise. This is the Marfino Sharashaka, a scientific institute staffed with prisoners in its most privileged period. No one is overseeing me, calling me to a cell, chasing me away from the bonfire. I am wrapped in a padded jacket, and even then it is chilly in the penetrating wind. But she, who has already been standing in the wind for hours, her arms straight down, her head drooping, weeping, then growing numb and still. And then again she begs piteously, "Citizen Chief, forgive me, please forgive me, I won't do it again." The wind carries her moan to me, just as if she were moaning next to my ear. The citizen chief at the gatehouse fires up his stove and does not answer. This was the gatehouse of the camp next door to us, from which workers came into our compound to lay water pipes and to repair the old ramshackle seminary building. Across from me, beyond the artfully intertwined, many-stranded barbed wire barricade, and 2 steps away from the gatehouse, beneath a bright lantern, stood the punished girl, head hanging, the wind tugging at her gray work skirt, her feet growing numb from the cold, a thin scarf over her head. It had been warm during the day when they had been digging a ditch on our territory, and another girl, slipping down into a ravine, had crawled her way to the Vladikino highway and escaped. The guard had bungled, and Moscow city buses ran right along the highway. When they caught on, it was too late to catch her. They raised the alarm. A mean, dark major arrived and shouted that if they failed to catch the fugitive girl, the entire camp would be deprived of visits and parcels for a whole month because of her escape. And the women brigadiers went into a rage. and they were all shouting, one of them in particular, who kept viciously rolling her eyes. Oh, I hope they catch her, the bitch. I hope they take scissors and clip, clip, take off all her hair in the front of the line. This wasn't something she had thought up herself. This was the way they punished women in the Gulag. But the girl who was now standing outside the gatehouse in the cold had sighed and said instead, at least she can have a good time out in freedom for all of us. The jailer overheard what she said, and now she was being punished. Everyone else had been taken off to the camp, but she had been set outside there to stand at attention in front of the gatehouse. This had been at 6 p.m., and now it was 11 p.m. She tried to shift from one foot to another, but the guard stuck out his head and shouted, stand at attention, whore, or else it'll be worse for you. And now she was not moving, only weeping. Forgive me, citizen chief. Let me into the camp. I won't do it anymore. But even in the camp, no one was about to say to her, all right, idiot, come on in. The reason they were keeping her out there so long was that the next day was Sunday, and she would not be needed for work. Such a straw, blonde, naive, uneducated slip of a girl. She had been imprisoned for some spool of thread. What a dangerous thought you expressed there, little sister. They want to teach you a lesson for the rest of your life. And there's the thought police in 1984, right? Fire, fire. We fought the war, and we looked into the bonfire to see what kind of a victory it would be. The wind wafted a glowing husk from the bonfire. To that flame and to you, girl, I promise, the whole wide world will read about you. So he was writing that in the 60s, and I think we'll leave it at this for today. I think it goes to show that 1984, in some sense, really is prophetic. It's like Orwell imagined it, what happens under totalitarian rule, and then Solzhenitsyn lived through it and then reported it. And the real, I find Solzhenitsyn more vivid than 1984 for sure. That last line I read there, we fought the war and we looked into the bonfire to see what kind of a war it would be. So in 1984, it's after a nuclear holocaust, more or less, that these totalitarian states have risen up in the ostensible purpose of keeping peace. And sometimes you have to wonder, is the peace worse than the war might have been? And I think that's what Solzhenitsyn's asking there. And then last thing here, what does an individual do in that situation? So what's the ethical choice for someone like Winston? Think of that last line. For the flame and for you, girl, I promise the whole world will read about you. You have to speak the truth, and that's what Solzhenitsyn did. And so one person putting his life on the line and speaking the truth was powerful enough to be one of the things that brought down a regime like the Soviet Union. And and we'll see what happens in chapter 2. So again, tomorrow 9:30, we'll do this live class and talk then. Have a good rest of your day.